This is what the sound of the death of the Australian gum trees and hardwood forestry through Lantana sounds like. Just so you get some sort of idea of the staggering number and the devastation being caused by Lantana in these environments when it's being illegally allowed to grow. The fires that follow the Lantana are just an incredible thing, the devastation being done. But that's what we battle with biosecurity and with the councils. Hey everybody, I'm Gary from Lantana Removal Queensland.com.au, and I'm out here again at the national parks at the Aguilar, having a look at the increase in Lantana on our lands. Under the Biosecurity Act, every entity property manager is responsible for lowering the mass of the material on their lands, not increasing it. So it's a very interesting scenario when the sign reads, "This park protects our natural and cultural heritage." It's a very interesting statement when you consider that these materials have increased over the last 2 years exponentially across these surfaces against the legal responsibilities of the biosecurity, of national parks, of TMR, and of the council, Somerset Council, local council. They're responsible with enforcement of the Act. See, this plant here is a perfect example of exactly how this works. You've got brand new buds coming on, brand new flowers coming on. You've got unripened seeds, and you've already got ripened seeds all over the place on this plant here. And you've got people within the biosecurity Queensland that try to mislead the public. You know, they say that it would relate to me taking those seeds and taking them to somewhere else and spreading them somewhere else. But the law really states that these seeds have to be stopped from being released into the environment. The plant has to be stopped from being released into the environment under the Biosecurity Act. The fact that Biosecurity Queensland have known for decades that councils have been circumventing the law and then lying to the public is a real issue for the amount of expansion of these materials. We see under the new Koala Act that the government actually comes up with a percentage rate of 15%. You can't remove any more than 15% of the Lantana on your property in regards to koala habitat, which is a staggering, ludicrous, stupidity, moron-based system that makes you wonder who came up with it and where they come up with it. If you've got a plant like this growing, okay, this plant in dry conditions expands at 400 brand new plants every year. And that's illegal for that to happen and for it to be released into the environment and then for it to be released into the watercourse here and then be transmitted all the way downstream through all the watercourses through everyone else's property. It's illegal. But under that situation, some idiot in the Koala Committee in the state government came up with 15%. Excuse me, that plant's propagating at 400%. And the most that a landowner can actually do legally, according to you, within the Koala Habitat Protection Program is 15%. Now, I have a little bit of trouble trying to understand how idiots within biosecurity, within the state government, in all of the departments, can come together with the koala idiots and then come up with 15% when something is propagating at 400%. I mean, you know, on a level of stupidity, that really defies any sort of, well, I suppose it's the typical of the Palaszczuk government, you know. But at the end of the day, when these plants are then within a watercourse, within a roadway where they're getting pumped water off the roadway, every time they get a drink of 25 millimeters of water, these plants then propagate at a rate of 6,000 new plants. So depending on whether that koala habitat stretches across any sort of watercourse or any roadway, then what's 15% compared to 6,000% expansion rate? And this stuff burns like petrol. When this stuff's put in amongst the trees here and then set alight, it's the responsibility for the fires being what they were that we saw at the beginning of the year and over the last 2 years. The potential of these plants are around 1.5 meters per plant. So if you work it out, it's about 1,800 plants per acre completely covered with this material. And depending on the height of this material, you can have it up to 10. You can have it 10 meters high and higher in these terrains. It can be a potential of around 4,000 cubic meters of material that's illegally grown there by councils and the state government circumventing environmental and biosecurity law with the help of the biosecurity officials. Now, trying to get answers out of biosecurity is like trying to extract teeth. It is a very difficult thing to try and do because they're trying to protect themselves in case they end up in court and their staff end up going to jail as a result of meeting their employers' or what would you call it? The employer's instructions on what they can or can't tell the public. But it doesn't explain why the heads of biosecurity are trying to mislead me and restrict me from talking to ground staff who should have knowledge of these things, which is an important thing for me to be able to establish. You know, who was it came up with this 15% rule? You know, what idiots got together and came up with this? You know, they obviously have no understanding of Lantana at all within biosecurity. That's very obvious. It's been shown. Look at it here. You know, they can't identify a plant. No, hold on, sorry. I was told yesterday that staff don't actually go out to site or travel along the road. So that's where that particular stuff comes about. These people don't actually go through and go to site. They rely on councils to come to them and tell them when there's a problem. So this is these people's legacy throughout their working career. This is 30 kilometers long of illegally grown lantana pouring out of a national park that's absolutely full of it above us, which is the same as every national park in Queensland and New South Wales. So at the end of the day, how do we stop the fires from destroying the complete ecosystems, which is what happens when they've allowed lantana to get to the stages that they have? It's illegal for lantana to be increasing on anybody's land. That's anybody's land. That includes the state government as well. Then this conspiracy between the councils operating illegally with the knowledge of biosecurity has to be properly brought in front of the courts, because the cost of these fires are the responsibility of these entities. Them allowing national parks, allowing TMR, allowing all other government entities to release these materials into the environment. That tree there, you'd have to call it a lantana tree. It's no longer a lantana shrub. I'd say he's probably about 15, 20 years old by the size of his trunks. Now, how did this material end up living here for so long when it's been so illegal for so many years? And the expansion rate ends up being what I put out to you. You know, one of these plants puts out 400 new plants. That's just one plant, okay? The second year, you've got 400 plants putting out 400 plants. That's 160,000 plants from that single plant on year 2. On year 3, you've got 160,000 times 400, which ends up being 36 million, if I'm remembering it correctly on that one there. Okay, that's on a third year. Okay, 36 million plants. So when you look at it from that point of view, you end up, I think the figure ends up being about 14,000 acres completely covered by one plant being allowed to keep propagating. And then you take that back and try to understand, where did this 15% come from? Okay, and you can't go over a 15% grade too. They are stopping people from safeguarding their lands and their homes from Australia's worst invasive weed, according to the top 10 universities in Australia. And the fires that we suffer now are record-breaking fires that set records last October and destroyed 2 complete rainforests. That has never been done in Australia before October last year. And our Premier Palaszczuk is directly responsible for those amounts of those materials being released into the environment by her secretly lowering the classification on Lantana around 2016, which was illegal under the environmental law. It's illegal for you to create a environmental disaster either by your actions or as a result of you failing to take action. Now, the Premier about 2 years ago indicated that she was aware that the councils were lying and misleading the public. She went as far as to name some of those councils in those documents to me, okay, but took no action to rectify the fact that the councils lying to the public stopped the public from taking action to stop these fires, to protect their own lands. I spent 40 years eradicating Lantana permanently and professionally. So at the end of the day, I have no equal in the world. At the end of that particular situation with how much this Lantana is expanding, because of that lowering of the classification and the circumventing of the law, we now have these fires at the levels that we have, and the propagation rates openly down the sides of the roads, all the way to the side of the bitumen. I mean, this is what you needed to see to understand the actual fire potential and why those fires that happened in the beginning of the year and over the last 2 years were so extreme, and why the flames were directly across the road. Now, you've got a Prime Minister hiding like a scared little sheep, trying to force a royal commission to go and ask national parks, how did these things happen? And like, national parks are going to tell them the truth. Look at the level of these seeds already on here, these berries that are unripened fruit, and ripened fruit up the back there, all through here, and flowers coming on. This is what you start to understand about 6,000 new plants per plant in an environment where it gets water from the roadways. This is completely illegal for these plants to be releasing their seeds into the environment, according to the Biosecurity Act. The government saying they have no money means either the government's bankrupt, okay, which I don't doubt with Palaszczuk, or, well, actually, forget the or. It is not a legal defence to claim that you don't have the money or the funding to deal with your responsibilities under the Biosecurity Act, General Biosecurity Obligations. It's legally not a defence. And every single council knows that. And yet every single council has allowed this to happen all the way from the border of Victoria all the way to the Daintree. And they did that with the Premier's knowledge, because the Premier indicated she was aware that these councils 2 years ago were lying to the public and misleading them about the dangers of Lantana. In writing, she has said to me that nowhere has she ever described Lantana as low risk. She understands the dangers and the spread rates and the cost of this stuff. She understands that under the Biosecurity Act, you can't claim you don't have the money to fix this. You can't have the claim to not have the money to deal with your obligations. It's actually Section 263 of the Biosecurity Act that the court has in place to enter properties for the workforce to enter properties and clean these materials up and bill the person that is responsible for those lands. Now, can anybody explain why the councils have not issued breach notices to the Forestry Service, which is just back down the road there, National Parks here, TMR on the footpath? How come they have not done their job? And biosecurity admit they know they haven't done their job. Biosecurity actually admit that they know these councils have been operating illegally all the way through, and that there's been a conspiracy between these entities. They know this because it is illegal for the council to have a law or a regulation set at a lower level than what the state government's level is, what the Biosecurity Act is. It's illegal. So both the Premier and Biosecurity admit that they have known all along that the councils have been circumventing environmental law and biosecurity law all the way through to protect national parks from having to meet their legal obligations. So who is to blame for the bushfires that wipe out these lands when they take off? Because that's what we're facing now, and that's what I'm filming now. This is pre-bushfire going through these terrains and other terrains, so that you understand when you're talking about hazard risk reduction and about legal obligations, you start to understand you're not talking about a few leaves on the ground. You're talking about 4,000 to 40,000 cubic meters of this material, which burns like petrol, on a hillside, on a mountainside, through that sort of country up there in the national parks. And it was illegal for this to happen. This is what you can see. That's not what you see when you go up into the national parks up there. And the councils never did anything about it. Now, biosecurity claim that they don't have staff that go out and check that people are doing their job, but biosecurity must have been responsible for checking the actual biosecurity plans that councils put in place. And when the Premier became aware that those councils were misleading their ratepayers and their residents and the nation's public, then the Premier had an obligation to the people of Queensland and the people of New South Wales for them to have taken action against those councils. There's some very, very grubby dealings in all of this stuff that cost us billions of animals and hundreds of billions of flora in 20 million hectares destroyed. And that's only the tip of the iceberg of what got destroyed in the beginning of the year. And that's what it looks like before it burns. I'll show you more down the road. So here we are in a different spot here looking at these materials. These materials are between 10 meters and 15 meters tall, and they climb the trees here in these areas. This is what the dead trees look like that come from the Lantana themselves and the bell miner birds, which you can hear everywhere around us here. Sources in the Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy say that these trees will kill you at 100 meters away with the amount of heat that they put out in a bushfire. This Lantana is the ignition source at around 40,000 cubic meters per acre in these particular terrains and areas. A lot of the material's actually deeper than that, taller than that. But with this amount of dead material and dying gum trees, there's heaps up there dying past this lot here, all in terrible distress because of the attack on the leaves by the insects, because the bell miner birds go and drive them off. All of those trees up there are the same. And all up through that section up there, if you look very closely, you start to see how many of the trees are actually dead in that terrain up there across the road, because the road loops around here and goes up the hill. You start to get a real understanding. And this guy over the back here, who's got barely a leaf left on most of his stems, and then just a few leaves at the top of the tree. So you start to get a scale of what they knew 30 years ago with lantana killing the gum trees that the koalas rely on, and then creating this ignition source. I remove lantana directly from the ground and burn it immediately, like within 30 seconds to, you know, a couple of minutes. Put it straight on the fire and I have no troubles burning it at all. See, this is the same thing I've said all along. You've got all these different flowers growing here, and then you've got unripened fruit, and down lower you'll have ripened fruit, all falling directly into a watercourse. And it's illegal to release lantana into the environment according to the Biosecurity Act by any landowner, land manager. It's illegal to allow that material to expand on the property that it's on. And the third part of it is it's especially illegal to allow that material to leave the property it's on and enter somebody else's lands, which these materials are being ejected immediately straight into the watercourse, and wherever they end up is where they end up. That gives you some sort of an idea of the sheer scale of this. And then you go up mountain ranges like this to where you've got 1 kilometre from the base up to the top of it, and you start to get a real understanding of the fire potential and how that affects these forests being completely burned out, and why we're having rainforests completely destroyed and making history. Like that's something that people should have been talking about. Climate change people should have been talking about. You know, you don't make history like that without hands-off forestry like the greenies have in place at the moment, with their people stationed in all sorts of sections of government. But there's no excuse for this. This is illegal. Only the fact that the Premier is allowing this to happen, knowingly allowing it to happen. This is TMR's lands, and then that borders immediately into the national parks. So who infested who doesn't really matter, whether it was national parks infested the TMR or TMR infested the national parks. We've got to stop these materials from being washed off the sides of roads and having access to unlimited water as a absolute priority. Because when these materials then start these fires straight up into canopy fires through burning massive amounts of dead material like these trees here, then they go up these mountainsides like a bullet. And that is where all of these fires become canopy fires, and the fireys tell you they don't understand why. Well, there's the reason that it happens, and they don't understand why. Well, we need to train the fireys better, because they need to understand what they're facing when they come to face these blazes. People don't understand how much dry and dead material is under lantana and how dense and thick the material is. I can't stick the camera into these type of infestations, and that's only a 2-inch camera. Can't stick them in there more than, you know, between 8 inches to a foot before they're jammed up and can't go any further. And most of that material underneath it's broken up dead dry material just waiting for that ignition source. And as I said, I burn the green stuff straight out of the ground with that brown stuff, and it just keeps going and going, no problems at all. In fact, I need rainy, drizzly days to keep the fires under control, and I run 3 fires at a time just to keep them under control, burning green material. It's an absolute ridiculous situation that the government allows so many entities to lie to you and mislead you. You know, this material is spreading at about 12 to 15 times the total area cleared in land clearing, and yet RSPCA and WWF mislead you by saying land clearing is the most deadly thing to koalas. This material is the most deadly thing to koalas because it forces the koalas and the predators into the same small area of habitat between the next lot of trees. And yet that's where I was getting angry before, that the some bright spark in the government that doesn't even understand lantana at all in the koala section is saying you can't clean up more than 15% of the lantana in one hit on your property. When you actually go back from that and you look at it, it's expanding at 400%. So where this can't do any more than 15% is an absolutely ridiculous situation. And you know, the spread rates on this material means it's doing far better than any operation to remove it at all, you know. And I'm the only one that's ever done permanent eradication of this material, so I have no equal in the world. But the government doesn't want to be forced to start cleaning up these materials on their lands, so that's why they set this in place, that the councils drive past this every day and they can't see the lantana. You'd have to think at some stage biosecurity drives past these materials and can't see them either, can't identify them. So with people like that responsible for protection of our environment, what chance does our environment have when we have the fires that destroyed every single living thing over 20 million hectares? You know, you've got to start laying blame where the blame deserves to be, and that's with the Premier and the Prime Ministers, who claim they weren't aware of this, but they've been told for 3 years about every part of this. They've had every part of it brought their attention, and in some cases the premiers have actually responded acknowledging that they're aware that the councils are lying to the public. See, the real key to us ever doing any good with these materials relies on the public being made aware of the need to destroy these materials, all of them, on your lands completely. If we get your lands cleaned up, then we punch holes in the continuous carpet of these materials and we open up the thoroughfares and the corridors for the animals to go through and get to the next lot of trees and to the next environment. And we open up the predators and everybody else out into a broader area where we can actually see them and deal with them. That's what we need to be doing, and that's how we need to attack it. Because at the end of the day also, the public's the one that decides where money gets spent. And while you're telling them that it's low risk, as these councils have been doing, or very low risk as they say, you know, the Premier was aware they were lying to the public, and that takes the public out of the picture. You know, every time these plants relay those seeds down, that even at that point then you are creating a huge cost factor for yourself. And once you get materials like this to the stage that they completely block out every other living thing, then you have the problem of rehabilitation, and the rehabilitation costs more than the removal and the eradication of the material. So if we treat lands that are uninfested or lands that are very lightly infested as the key areas to protect by educating the public, see, that doesn't cost very much money. Just educate communities and publics to understand how these materials affect things in fires, because every time they were burnt out by the national parks, they weakened the native forestry and they came back even stronger every single time. And the national parks tried every conceivable variation of fire regimes. It does not work with lantana, okay? It does not work with lantana to mulch lantana, and it does not work with lantana to slash lantana. Slashing lantana hybridizes the plant, as does many of the other things you do to it, and it causes it to put out far more stems per plant at a shorter distance out and much quicker to flower. So it increases the speed and propagation that the plant itself puts out, because it doesn't waste all of its time in growing straggly like this. It grows as a much more condensed plant down at ground level and spreads much quicker across the ground. So for goodness sake, don't slash lantana and don't mulch it. You know, mechanical removal and then eradication is the only way to permanently eradicate lantana and to keep the costs as low as possible. Poisoning doesn't work. You can only poison this section, and you can only do it for 2 months of the year, and it can only be and it's not successful, okay? So by the time you would cut paths through and you would get access to things, you can't do anything with poisons. And a poison that kills lantana, because it's a woody plant, will kill the trees as well. So poisons don't work. But they were the misleading things that the councils and the state government were leading people towards, instead of being honest with people and telling them don't let it grow in the first place. That's my advice to you. Don't buy property with it on it. Don't buy property where it's growing on the sides of the roads like this. You would never buy property anywhere where you witness that type of corruption of the council, of TMR, of biosecurity, and of your Premier. You know, your Premier is aware of all of this, and she had the opportunity to come out and see it firsthand and have it explained to her how this material moves, how it gets into the water systems, how it propagates, and how we identify the highest value targets and where lantana can never be allowed to grow. But for God's sake, don't buy property with lantana on it. Unless you're willing to spend huge amounts of money, don't get involved in that. It's just not worthwhile. You know, there are a lot of places like this off the mountain where, you know, you will be trying to hold back a tide that is impossible for you to deal with, and it wasn't your tide in the first place, and your government doesn't support you to get that result. And then have a look at the new regulations they're trying to bring in through the Koala Act. Koalas can't live where this material is like this. Can you imagine, when you have a look at that, how does a koala walk through that to get to the next tree? Okay? How does a koala get through that to walk to the next tree? Now, your intelligence has been insulted that the government throws a net across all the lands and says, well, this is all potential koala habitat and we must protect it all, and then they grow material like that. There's no koalas in this area, can guarantee it. They can't get through this material, okay? And that's what a huge amount of this entire area that they are talking about, what's-the-naming off, and then they don't even have the skills anyway to say that you can only take out 15% of this material. You want to take out 100% of this material, because at the end of the day, nothing lives in this material or under this material. That's a fact. You can photograph when the material comes out and there's nothing been in that leaf litter at all in decades. That's where the problem is. They start to mislead you and say, well, moths and butterflies. Moths don't live in that stuff. They live in the grasses when it's pouring rain, and they have nothing to do with the lantana. Butterflies use the little flowers. Well, butterflies were eating something before there was lantana there. And if we don't start taking this material very seriously, the fires and the climate change that this material causes through the fires are going to mean that we are going to have, you know, 20 million hectare episodes every single year and more. We're going to have 100-kilometre fire fronts when these range countries all link up, because there's only a small amount of farms between each one of the range country, and they all link up and they all become one fire. That's what we're going to see next year and the year after, or I should say this year and the year after. But that's, until we deal with that, there's no chance for the future for any of this or any of the animals involved in it. And that's why the Premier wants to control your land, because she gets a free caretaker that she can kick the living crap out of, not pay, and hold you responsible. And yet the council was supposed to go after TMR and national parks for this here. So let me ask you a question. So this material here sitting on this side of the road with the water pouring off that road there, 6,000 new plants per plant per year. Every single plant's about 1.5 metres, so there's 1,800 plants per acre. Where does this material end up? No one can tell you. It's downstream in somebody else's lands and that somebody else's property that had nothing to do with any of this criminal activity. So what is the future under your Premier's control? This plan, as they have it now, councils lie to the public, and councils have zero operations in Lantana, and we don't want them to be doing anything with Lantana because they're useless at the best of times. But they are supposed to be handing out notices that this stuff needs to be cleaned up, and then TMR, main roads, national parks are supposed to be, bringing in contractors and cleaning up. But for 20 years, they haven't been doing their job, and biosecurity's been aware that this has been going on for the last 20 years. Not just from when the Premier lowered the classification to try to pretend that they could do this. But what she didn't alter was the Biosecurity Act, and the Biosecurity Act is the law as far as Lantana is concerned. You cannot release this stuff into the environment, you cannot allow this material to increase, and you cannot allow this material to leave the area it's in. So what means is this organisation using to contain this material and stop its spread? Yeah, you're right, there's none. So the Premier knew this was going on and knew the fire potential of these materials, knew that it was in these types of terrains. See, when these materials start a canopy fire into the trees, everything in front of that canopy fire becomes superheated and instantly ignited, okay? And depending on the slope, every degree it goes up, it doubles in speed. And that doesn't have any relevance to the wind draft and the amount of wind across the land. That's just the rule of thumb for fireys as far as the speed that it goes up the hillside. But once it becomes a canopy fire, it becomes its own fuel source, its own incinerator in front of it, and the speed that it goes up the mountain is like a bullet. And then it jumps across to the next ridge line, down into the bottom of the gully, and then burns back to itself like a flamethrower. So when the fireys tell you that when it goes down the next hill, it goes downhill slowly but comes uphill fast, it's not true. Because when the fire ends up lighting the fire over the hillside in the bottom of the gully, it sucks the fire back to itself. So it wasn't true that it comes back up the hill slowly. There are all sorts of things that you're being misled about. But having 40,000 cubic metres per acre of material that isn't allowed to be there, that is illegal for it to be released into the environment, is why the fires are completely obliterating every tree and every living thing on those terrains. It's not climate change as such that changed that. It's pure mathematics of a material that it was illegal for it to be there in the first place, and it's destroying the trees as you see here, which become an enormous fuel source. And all the trees around this area are all suffering the same thing. If you look at the leaves, you actually can see they are all starting to die, and some of them are very close to dying. That huge big gum tree over there, look at the amount of leaf on that. Okay, that thing is dying in exactly the same way that these guys died here. That guy over there is just about dead. That one behind here, as we said before, is just about dead. And up that hillside, there's an enormous amount of dead trees and dying trees. And that is this bell miner bird you can hear here with the lantana. And that's been known about for 30 years. We have places in Queensland and in New South Wales like this here, where all of the trees died on a mountainside like that, and then the mountainside gave way when all of the vegetation was dead on it, and it landslid the whole mountainside down into the ravine. We're seeing that all over, and you don't hear a word about it. You only hear the Premier saying, we just started this new Koala Act because we're so worried about the decimation of the koalas. Well, you can't have lantana growing and growing like she has it, knowingly, illegally growing it on Crown lands with the council's circumventing environmental law for you and running defence for you. You can't care a damn about the koalas or about the fires that were caused by this material starting all these fires into canopy fires. Anyway, we'll see you on the next one. I'm Gary, lantanaremovalqueensland.com.au, 0449 986 880, and I have no equal in lantana in the world. call me. We do work all over Queensland and New South Wales, and we are the only expert in permanent eradication of lantana. But you also need to share these things and to push these things around for your children's sake, because one day your children are going to be responsible for the property you own. And when this material comes across your borders onto your land, and we see properties that are being consumed at around $10,000 a year to $20,000 plus a year, then they have a real problem, because under environmental law, you are responsible for that land. If you purchase that land, you're responsible for it. So when the weeds take over, they can eventually come back to you and go, you know what, that you have to deal with that, but they caused all this. But they're taking no responsibility for it, and they have it on their records as having traveled 2,000 kilometers. Okay, so we have to start getting very serious about climate change and understanding how climate change is affected by Lantana Camara, which is Australia's worst invasive weed in Australia for endangered species, which was found by the top 10 universities in Australia, sorry, not in Queensland, in Australia. That's a huge issue, and it's something we have to deal with. Anyway, I'll catch you on the next one.